Welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Auron MacIntyre. Auron is a YouTuber, commentator, and a recovering journalist. Auron, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. I'm very excited to talk to you. I think your insights are always interesting, and you're one of my favorite follows on Twitter. I know that I'll give you a chance to do plugs at the end, but I just want to recommend to everybody check out Auron on Twitter and also his YouTube channel. And I'm sure he'll mention that at the end when I ask him about plugs. But he's a great guy to kind of get insights that you might not see anywhere else about what's going on. And I wanted to start off sort of on that note by asking you about something that I know it's a few weeks old, but I feel like it was a big enough kind of flashpoint in the culture wars that has been interesting to me that I do want to continue talking about it this week. And that's the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, particularly the media coverage surrounding it. So the thing that I noticed that I want to ask you about, Auron, is that the media coverage, the media propaganda, I'll go out on a limb and call it that, surrounding Kyle Rittenhouse, it came off as particularly unhinged and sort of untethered to the truth in a way that previous smear campaigns they had engaged in really didn't, to me, in the past, if you compare it maybe to 2018's campaign against Brett Kavanaugh and other similar campaigns. It came off as sort of lacking the rhetorical sleight of hand and rhetorical trickery and sort of obfuscation tactics and lies by omission, sort of those tactics that they typically like. And it seemed to be very based in just sort of this unhinged, ravenous, like bold-faced lying. It was very transparent with its intentions and its hostilities. And what I wanted to ask you about that, because it sort of left me a little confused about what maybe is going on in the inner machinations of the sort of media arm of the cathedral, is did you get the same sense that I did that this was different? And if you did, do you think that's a sign that the media is getting more brazen or perhaps more desperate? Like, what do you think that signals?
One of the things that I think is most interesting that I've watched with the Rittenhouse saga in particular is how we're constantly drinking from a fire hose, right? Of just messaging from the media, nonstop. It's just, you never get a break. You never get to breathe. And so, especially, with the last few summers, we really had this push of the narratives. Obviously, George Floyd and the riots that came after BLM riots and everything that was happening. Every story that came out was about some minority suspect being attacked or shot or killed by a police officer. And I think people got so used to the rhythm of that, and things were coming so fast and furious, that when the Rittenhouse story came out, a lot of people, like a really large amount of people, thought Kyle Rittenhouse had shot a bunch of black protesters during that violence. And they continued in that belief all the way up until about a week before the verdict. Like there was a number of high profile liberal commentators who had to at some point stop and actually admit that they did not understand that the people involved in the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting were white. Like everyone involved was of a similar racial makeup. I think Rittenhouse is technically Hispanic, so he might have been the most person of color involved in the whole thing.
Yeah, the most melanin.
Right. And so there's this situation where, Scott Adams famously said, two people, or, two sets of people watching the same movie and getting two entirely different things, like one screen, two different movies. But we're increasingly in an area where there's almost two entirely different sets of facts available to people. And you could be a high-profile left-wing news commentator. Your job is nothing but reporting news. And you could honestly make it all the way to a few days before the end of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial before realizing there was no actual racial aspect to this crime or this self-defense, either direction. And so it's really weird because, like you said, it feels very sloppy But in some ways, they almost didn't need to do anything because the momentum had built up. Even the members of the media were so used to the repetitive storyline. Like, why would any story be brought to the forefront if it only involved white suspects and white victims? And, why would this even be an issue? The only reason it could possibly be in the news is because it involved a crime based on racial animus. And so I think that's what led to a lot of this very loose feeling to the whole thing. Is a large amount of the narrative didn't even take into account the actual basic facts of what happened. Forget like who's actually defending themselves or the actual law involved, all of which they, of course, as news commentators didn't understand or didn't care to understand or were actively obfuscating. But it was to the point where they just didn't know the basic background of like who was shooting and who got shot, just the very basic facts, and they weren't, like the actual commentators just weren't aware of them.
Yeah, it's almost as if I like what you're saying, because it brings me to the idea that there was all of that momentum. There's a sort of another option I haven't considered, which is it could be a sign that they're getting more brazen or more desperate, but also that they were just increasingly lazy. I mean, at this point, I think that when I think about what you've said, it makes me think about how with the George Floyd thing, which had happened just a few months earlier, they had this big tool to use, which was the video of George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, which on first glance to pretty much anyone looks very bad. And they were able to use that to a great effect. And they knew they didn't have a lot of work to do. They didn't try to contextualize it, but they don't really have to. People are going to make the assumptions that they're going to make. And I don't think they could have ever imagined that in this case, they would end up with video evidence that did the exact opposite, that made them look like morons. And they didn't seem to want to look into that at all, even though the video evidence in this case was available from the very beginning. The irony of it all that I'm also just realizing is, as you mentioned, everyone who was shot, killed, or injured, and although Rittenhouse, I guess it is kind of ambiguous whether he's Hispanic or white, but whatever, but all of the supposed, alleged victims were white. And it's the first time that I can remember in recent history that the media has asked us to care about white people being shot. It's a very weird thing.
Yeah, you contrast this then to the parade recently, right? Where the SUV was driven into a bunch of people who were watching a Christmas parade by someone who, by all accounts, had some pretty explicit Black nationalist leanings, was very aggressive towards white people on things like Facebook and other platforms. Obviously, we don't know the entirety, unfortunately, of that, and I don't think it's an accident of why we don't know more about that story. But yeah, it's obvious that this was a terrorist attack at some level, and that was so quickly swept under the rug. It really is only because that was a Black Matters Life protest, or Black Lives Matters protest. At least it was supposed to have started that way in Kenosha, that I think that story even registers, right? If they could turn that into a mass shooting of Black Lives Matter protesters, then that's a win for the cathedral. That's a win for the left. So I think that's the only reason that narrative even got floated, was because at least they were marching for the right thing. And so therefore, and we saw some of this, there were a number of commentators who kind of, said, well, this conveys honorary political Blackness, to these people. And it's so weird because then you see them talk about how people like Clarence Thomas are politically white. And at some point you realize what this is really all about, right? At some point it becomes very obvious what we're doing here.
Yeah, I was actually thinking exactly that what it comes down to. I was thinking exactly that sort of phraseology of politically Black, politically white. I think there was very much an attempt to say, okay, well, these people were white people at a Black Lives Matter protest over, Jacob Blake, who is Black, having been shot, a few days, maybe it was a couple weeks prior. And the Jacob Blake thing is a whole thing in its own, if anyone actually wants to look up the details of what happened
absolutely.
There. But that is such a bizarre thing, and yet I do think it's very important for people to understand that it's almost like the idea of race it transcends, or the idea of politics transcends race for the media. I do think that they basically do look at people in terms purely of ideology. Your skin color, in a weird way, almost doesn't matter. It's like a weird form of color blindness, where if you have inconvenient leanings or political ideology like Clarence Thomas, you cannot be Black. Candace Owens, any of these people, you see a lot of rhetoric about how they are politically white, or how they're race traitors or whatever. It was Michael Eric Dyson recently. Oh, he was talking about, I remember who it was now. He was talking about, I think, the lieutenant governor elect of Virginia, who is a Black woman, and saying that she's politically white. When he said, and he phrased it in a way that only Michael Eric Dyson could phrase it, which is that, like, when I see her lips moving, I see white lips. And it was just like, Jesus Christ, only Michael Eric Dyson.
Well, what they've done is they've taken the friend enemy political distinction and they've racialized it in a very awkward way, so that when they say Black or white, they mean friend or enemy. But because they default to this language, it puts us in an extremely dangerous space. Like they're playing with fire, like incredibly dangerous fire, and they don't care because they feel like they've created for so long. They've had this basically trump card in all situations, which is just racism, right? And when racism stopped having quite the same sting, it became, white supremacy, and now it's becoming fascism. We see it get ratcheted up, right? The title for enemy is getting more and more extreme, to the point where it's very clear they're just rhetorically justifying violence without much thought about it. And that's, of course, a very dangerous place to be, because it doesn't take much. I don't want to be the yet another person saying, like, eventually people will snap at this kind of thing, but you can't continually to play this game for forever and think there will be no consequences. And in some ways, that's what they want. They want consequences, because when they see action along those lines, that gives them the boogeyman they need, right? These people have been selling this story of, the backlash of white America. They've been doing it for years now. It's just not actually happening. But the minute it does, then all of their predictions get fulfilled and they get the enemy that they wanted the whole time, right? So they feel like they're in a win-win situation, but it's certainly not a win for the country. It's certainly not a win for the average person. It's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the potential for backlash, Auron. And I know that we hear it, every day. We've been hearing it from like Dave Rubin for 5 years now, that there's going to be the big backlash and everything's going to be great. There's going to be 4 terms of Donald Trump or whatever it is he's been saying. But by the way, Dave, I'd love it if you'd come on the show. But in any case, I'm glad you brought up that, because it leads to there's another aspect of this all that I want to talk about that sort of is along those lines, which is that it's been another one of these big flashpoints in the culture wars, where these seem to happen every 6 months to a year, where there's a big moment where a lot of people who are sort of on the progressive left come out, oh, this red pilled me, this quote unquote red pilled me. I am, discovering the horrors of the cathedral and the woke orthodoxy and progressive politics and what it's doing. And it struck me this time, and I'm just very curious kind of what your response was, because my response with the Kyle Rittenhouse case in particular, and you've seen this a little bit with the Waukesha car attack as well, but especially with Kyle Rittenhouse, is that this time I couldn't help but kind of roll my eyes at it a little bit, only because I have a hard time understanding. Like I think my red pill moment was back in like 2017. Some people it was earlier than that. Some people it was between that and then the Black Lives Matter riots in 2020 surrounding George Floyd. To me, that felt like the kind of last call. The train is leaving the station. If you don't notice this now, it's kind of hard to take you seriously. And so I wanted to ask you, because then, there's the other part of me that says, I have two minds about it, because part of me is like, you should always celebrate people acknowledging that they're wrong and coming, starting that journey, which takes a long time of sort of coming to an understanding about how the society actually works. But it's a little eye roll inducing at this point, just because so many things have happened where it was like, how did this not wake you up? How do you feel about the sort of red pilling phenomenon at this point? It was such a big meme from like 2016 to 2020. Do you think it's sort of almost past its sell-by date in a way? What are your feelings towards that phenomenon?
Well, it's funny because you've been on our side of the fence long enough now to where you can feel what we've been feeling for a while.
Yeah, I know. It's only been 4 or 5 years, but I definitely am at that. I have that sort of eye roll reaction.
So there's this thing about history, and it's that almost no one really thinks about it. And so if you look at history, you realize that we've been marching left pretty hard and pretty fast for quite a long time. And what constitutes the right at this point in America is what we would call neocons, right? Which is people who were left, who found some parts of new leftism distasteful, and then come over to the right. And if you've been on the right for a long time, like me, since basically I was like 10, if you've been on the right for a long time, you've seen this cycle happen a lot, right? Like every 5 to 10 years, the left goes too far for a noticeable percentage of its adherents, and some of the some names that used to have cachet move to the right. They say, I can't believe the left has gone this far. I was on board for liberalism up to this point. This is so old. Ronald Reagan said it, right? Like I didn't leave the left left me, right? This is not a new phenomenon. This has been happening for over 100 years on the American right, at least. And so what we look at as new leaders in the right today are Clinton Democrats from the 90s, right? Like, Dave Rubin, and Dave seems like a nice guy, but he's just a leftist. Like, he's just a leftist from 10 years ago, and he hasn't changed many of his opinions, a few, but really at the end of the day, it's still almost all leftism. And so the reason that one of the reasons the right never goes anywhere in America is the vast majority of the right's leadership is just people who've been cast off of the left and can't grift over there anymore. And so they come to the rights and find a home, among people who are welcoming because they're desperate for like high profile people to acknowledge what's going on. And so they welcome them then in, and then they change a few things to make themselves more welcoming. And, by the end of the decade, every conservative opinion is just what the left believed 20 years ago. And so is it eye rolling? Yeah, but I've been rolling my eyes for a long time on this, right? Like, and it's not that it's bad for people to come over. It's not like you said, every journey starts somewhere. But one of the big problems is the right doesn't gatekeep. In fact, not only does it not gatekeep, it actively embraces the next batch of neocons that come over in the next 5 to 10 year wave, which constantly pulls the right to the left, and which is why the right seems like it doesn't actually get anything done, because it literally ideologically doesn't oppose what the left was 20 years ago. In most cases, it's desperate to go back to what the left was 20 years ago. That's all it really wants. It's not actually looking for a different vision, different ordering principles. And I think that's what's got to change if you want to see anything actually go anywhere.
Yeah, it is sort of a losing mentality. One joke that I've been making lately is that come 2032, Bill Maher is going to be the Republican nominee for president or something like that. I feel like he's next on the list. He's one of the big ones coming up to really cross over. I mean, he's always been, a little bit critical of the left, but lately he's really coming to Jesus, if you will.
That's the problem. Bill never will. I think it's. I don't think he ever. No, and if only because literally he'll never come to Jesus. Not to put too fine a point on it, but I mean seriously, that's the kind of change it takes. The problem with most of the people coming from left to right, again, is they're only uncomfortable with the last 10 years of leftism. Their problem is not, I was wrong and I need to fundamentally change my understanding of what this is. Their problem is, I got shoved out. I got betrayed. And when that is your mindset, you're just coming to the right to make it more what the left was. You're just shaping. I mean, it's the IDW. It's all these guys, right? They're just trying to shape the right into something slightly, the left from 20 years ago. That's all they're really trying to do. And if Bill ever makes that journey, which honestly I don't think he's going to do, but if he does, that's the only manner in which he'll do it. Yeah,
this really gets into something I've been thinking lately as I've I won't pretend that I am deeply versed in neo-reactionary thought. I know you're a good person to talk to about that, so I'm excited to speak to you about it today. But I have sort of, I follow a lot of people on Twitter who are kind of in that wheelhouse, and I've done a little bit of reading. My introduction to this form of political thought came through a distributist video where he talks about, Mencius Moldbug and Curtis Yarvin, who I know was recently on Tucker Carlson. But I've been thinking lately a lot about how I differentiate between what I see as the three prongs of the sort of, if you can call it this, I know there's probably a better phrase, but I refer to it as just the anti-woke coalition. The three prongs being your sort of classical liberals or basically leftists that you're referring to, who are more in the kind of intellectual dark web space, your establishment conservatives, and your neo-reactionaries or dissident right, which is that I'm curious what you'll think of this, Auron. I've been thinking of it in terms of, it almost seems to boil down to when you think and you were kind of talking about this before, it almost seems to sort of boil down to when you think the cultural decay in our society really began, or when the seeds for it were planted. Because people in the intellectual dark web would say, like, okay, circa 2010, which is very recently. People on the establishment right will probably say sometime between 1960 and 2000, like the latter half of the 20th century. And it seems to me that neo-reactionary thinkers think that a lot of these problems are steeped in the system of liberal democracy itself, and that it goes back long before the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s.
Yeah. Take it back to around the 1780s. Yeah.
Yeah. So is that a useful way of thinking of those kind of three groups? Because that's something that I've been using lately to help me understand the, again, quote unquote, anti-woke coalition and its different factions.
I would say that that's probably a good summation of kind of the forward-facing part, right? Like I think due to maybe the amount of theory that it has, neo-reactionary thought has been kind of brought to the forefront recently with the dissident right, but there are many in the dissident right who don't like neo-reaction. They think it's far too liberal for them, or something to that effect. So they might not appreciate a characterization of the whole dissident right as neo-reactionary, but I think it is a good understanding to probably say that you have kind of your classical liberals, the cast-offs, your classic conservatives, and then your kind of dissident right is probably a good way to understand that. Yeah.
Do you see any hope for them to kind of work together effectively? They haven't really seemed to have been doing that for the past few years.
No, and it's because there's fundamental problems. Like I said, the classical liberal really has no overlapping interest with the other two groups at all. Like they don't see a problem with anything beyond wokeness, but every part of wokeness is in classical liberalism. Like every part of it, all the seeds of what would become wokeness are sitting somewhere in 80s, 90s liberalism and everything before it. You can't just get rid of it because you rolled it back a patch or two. That's a completely losing strategy. And even this is true in a lot of ways of conservatism. Especially conservatism post Reagan is almost entirely liberal. They'll hiss at you if you say that, but it's 100% the case. They are totally on board with completely atomized existences for people. They're completely on board with a lot of the assumptions, especially economically, that liberalism brings to the table. And so I think it's very difficult to form. You have a loose coalition of, just like I said, people who oppose wokeness, but any kind of coordinated action is almost impossible from get-go, because you can't even negotiate a basis for agreement.
Yeah, I think that what you're speaking to is the fact that any attempt to kind of align these groups might start off seeming kind of promising until you get to the action stage, or so the solution stage of, like, what do we do now that we've had a gay old time agreeing a lot? What do we do? Because when you think the problem began, like I was kind of talking about before, will correlate very strongly to the level of radicalism in your proposed solutions. And as you were saying, the proposed solutions of the classical liberals are really light little adjustments of what we've got going on right now. Whereas in neo-reactionary thought, there's criticism of liberal democracy itself, which to the classical liberals and also really to the establishment conservatives is like a non-starter. So it kind of stalls at that point of action.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd find at the end of the day a little more sympathy for it in the conservative movement once you strip away some of the think tank layers. I mean, you look at Trump, and I mean, he's it's called a Caesarism, right? Like that's if you look at most of Trump's base, if you look at the people, the average everyday person who is following Trump, that's where his support came from. It didn't come from the think tanks. It didn't come from the National Review. These people were all against him, and so there might be some sympathy there once you peel away some of the leadership layers of classical conservatism. But the problem is they own everything, right? They own the funding, they own the organizations, they have all the talk radio shows. They're the people who are informing the opinions of conservatives and letting them know what's politically possible. One of the reasons Trump did as well as he did is he ignored them. He ignored what they told him was politically possible, and he went out and promised people the moon. Now, he fell well short of a lot of that stuff, but just his willingness to ignore the people who had been placed in front of him as authorities is what allowed him to really grab that zeitgeist and run on it in a way that no one else had. And I think that's what you're going to need if you want to steer the modern conservative movement towards anything beyond just being progressivism going the speed limit, as Michael Malice likes to say.
Yeah. Do you think there's any hope in the near future for a similar kind of break the simulation moment? Because that was really what it felt like, was this breaking of the simulation, of the sort of expected, ebb and flow of things between the I forget the exact term, the controlled opposition or the loyal opposition, nature of the Republican Party, and then the Democrats just lurching to the left every 4 to 8 years or so. Do you think there's any hope for another moment like that? I know that there's a possibility that Trump runs again. Some people really like Ron DeSantis. Do you see anything in the near future that could create the kind of energy that we saw in 2016 again, or do you think that was like a once in a lifetime moment?
Well, I'm as you are well aware, I'm not a fan of democracy, and I don't have a lot of faith in its ability to change the status quo. It's designed to do exactly the opposite. But that said, whatever comes next will come out of something with democratic trappings, something with the trappings of democracy, whatever stage comes next, because that's what happened with the managerialism we have now. And so I think you've got some interesting options. Trump's going to run again. I don't know what happens with that. He didn't do a whole lot once he was in office. He's clearly better than Biden, but he's nothing more than a slight application of the brakes. I don't think, even though I think the Trump movement was powerful, and Trump should get full credit for creating that energy and harnessing it and moving it in a particular direction.
Yeah.
But he didn't know what to do with it, and he staffed up with a bunch of people who were going to subvert it. And you can see now that all that energy has been funneled right back into conservatism Inc. with a new coat of paint. All the people who swooped in and stole all the energy from the Tea Party and monetized it and turned it back into mainstream conservatism are doing the exact same thing with the Make America Great Again movement. The MAGA movement has become exactly what the Tea Party became. It's a new place to fundraise for the same old Republican politicians.
Yeah, everything seems to sort of be brought back into the fold of the sort of the think tank and conservatism. The conservative Inc. is one of my favorite terms that I've learned of over the last few years, just because people like Charlie Kirk, there's a sort of emotional aura that they give off that is just very, I don't know how anyone could find some of those types to be the kind of person you would want to engage with, especially if you want to get things done. It's very bizarre to me. I guess it comes off as just as bizarre to me how so many people expect these sort of like socialisty woke people who are sort of dressed in their own hypocrisy constantly, and it's very transparent. The same way that I see people as kind of being duped by them, I see a lot of people being duped by your sort of conservative Inc. types, and then just the Republican Party as a whole, which man, they have more opportunities than they realize to do stuff, and they just never do it. And it does baffle me quite often.
Well, that's a feature, not a bug, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the thing to understand is, the purpose of the Washington Generals is not to beat the Harlem Globetrotters. The purpose is to lose.
Mm.
That's their role in the play. And conservatives are, I think, very fed up with this, but they don't know where else to go. And the problem is the Republican Party absorbs all of their energy. It's the only vehicle that they see before them, which is, again, why I'm not particularly optimistic about the democratic solutions, because anything people do ends up getting funneled right back into this. Now, there are some promising developments, like you mentioned, Ron DeSantis. It's funny. Last couple of days, people have been losing their mind because they think Ron DeSantis is amassing his own private army, because he was talking about a state guard, which is something that already exists in many states. But he is someone who at least seems to understand the principle of kind of separating himself as much from the federal government as possible is a good political move for him. Like, he understands, even if he doesn't have an overall plan, even if he doesn't have like Ron DeSantis's 15 plans to, overtake the American empire, like, he has at least the political instincts of understanding, like, every time I do this, it benefits me and people become more excited about me. And if that's the kind of thing that gets rewarded, others will follow in his path. Like, I don't think DeSantis is going to be the guy any more than I think Trump is going to be the guy. But someone is watching DeSantis and watching Trump, and they're seeing what works. And so eventually someone will figure this out. But in the meantime, you can only hope that you're in a situation where, these people, I guess, can shelter their areas of the country as much as possible from just kind of the decay in Washington. That really is in many ways the best outcome, I think, for a lot of regions under these people.
One aspect of this that I'm very curious about in terms of the long term, kind of as you were referring to, I mean, we might not see anything particularly exciting or risky in the next few years or so, but maybe the seeds are being laid. I'm curious about your thoughts in the long term. This is something where I'm not particularly well informed on the finer aspects of sort of neo-reactionary thinking, whatever it might be, but I do know about the importance of the criticism of liberal democracy as the system. As you were saying, you're not really a fan, and even these days I'm kind of on the fence about democracy, which is a big change for me. But my question is, and this might just be a fact that I'm not particularly well informed on this school of thought, but I'm curious what I could learn from you, Auron. If liberal democracy is not the way, and it is the way that society has operated for at least a few hundred years, or America has, how would you describe alternative systems that are being entertained by kind of the neo-reactionaries? Like, what do those look like, if they, or is it just sort of they reject liberal democracy from the get-go and are sort of open to other ideas? Or are there specific systems that are sort of brought into the conversation? And if so, what do those look like?
Sure. So you're probably somewhat familiar with Aristotle's dissection of the three political systems, which are democracy, monarchy, and oligarchy. And so everything is going to be one of these or a mixture of them. Of course, America was originally set up to be a mixture, right? This to be monarchical in some aspects, aristocratic in others, and mildly democratic, or at least it was since the Constitution. Articles of Confederation are a different thing altogether. We can do that some other time if you want to, but that's the way it was set up. Most people don't think about the fact that America originally only 1/2 of the government was actually elected by the people. And the people, even for that 1/2 of the government, was a very relatively small portion of the country that actually had the franchise. So the idea that America was birthed in democracy is, already suspect on its face. But of course, the Roman system and the American system themselves are on which the obviously Americans were LARPing as Romans, but they were looking at this mixed government style, right? But of course, obviously, then that also leaves us monarchy. Again, a lot of people have pointed this out. I won't be the first one, but America is only barely a democracy. It's an oligarchy. It's an oligarchy with a democratic stamp, because that's always what happens to your democracy. Is eventually those that can manipulate the population are the ones who rule it. But monarchy would be obviously the other of Aristotle's three systems, and it's one that most neo-reactionaries have a preference for. Again, not all. It's neo-reactionary thought is again a mode of political analysis. It's not a movement or a political party as much as it's often treated that way. It's many people have many different ideas about what solutions look like, and they can agree with the neo-reactionary analysis of power while having no agreement on solutions. But I would say the monarchy would be the one that the most of them would settle on in one way or another.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me because on paper, and I really emphasize on paper, everyone in America loves democracy, and it would make you think like no one would ever even think to change to any other kind of system. But the point that I've been making lately to people, just on the note of people changing their mind in big ways, is when you look at what preferences in the population were manufactured via constant media propaganda, like you were saying before, the fire hose of media propaganda and the sort of concerted efforts of the cathedral, it is very sad to look at and very kind of disgusting to look at, but it's also in some weird way kind of inspiring, because it's the ability to change people's minds to going from, let's say, for instance, on paper, thinking democracy is the only way, don't even talk to me about anything other than democracy. The potential to change people's minds or to change people's preferences is very clearly there, because we've seen this massive shift even over the course of the last like 10 to 20 years in terms of what people will agree to. So when I think a lot of people just say like, oh, you'll never get people to agree to any other kind of system. It's just, there's no way. And I'm like, it seems like you can convince people of anything. That's the one positive thing I've taken away from the past like 10, 20 years.
Yeah, that's both terrifying in one way and reassuring in another, right? Because in one way you realize that the ground under you can shift at any moment. But if you're in a terrible place, at least the ground under you can shift at any moment, right? And so, yeah, if you look, I mean, explain to someone 3 years ago that you were going to need to lock people in Australia in concentration camps. Like they were going to take Aborigines in Australia and fence them in barbed wire. And like the New York Times would like cheer them for it. Explain that to any human being 3 years ago and tell me that the masses can't change their opinion on a dime, right? Now, I will say the attempt to change the opinion of the masses on a dime is dangerous. And that is why I think, like you said, we see in many ways the media narrative gets sloppy, because they are so often completely attempting to change the opinion of the average person almost 180 degrees in very short order. But on a slower timeline, it's absolutely possible. And it's particularly possible when things fall apart, which is not a place that I want to be. It's not a place I want my family to be. It's not a place I want my community to be. But unfortunately, it looks like it's a place we're going no matter what I want. And so what you want to think about is what comes next in those scenarios. And, we're looking at mild things like supply line disruptions. You can't get wood. You can't get cars. You can't get computer chips. That stuff is low tier right now. It's annoying, but people can figure it out. When the food stops coming, when you start getting rolling brownouts, when basic things start to break down, you'd be amazed what people would be willing to do to get the lights back on and the food to keep coming in, imports. And so I do think that's when you will see people looking for different things. I really hope, that we don't end up in that position, but the way the people who run things are going, I don't see how we don't eventually.
Yes. Yeah. I was just going to say I think up until maybe, and this speaks to the fact that my journey obviously started a lot more recently than yours, but up until the last like 2 years, I thought it was still a matter of if, but the last like 2 years have very much made me feel like it's a matter of when we get to a point where things, I mean, I always talk about phase shifts and like these moments like, oh, the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings and the Rittenhouse trial. There's going to be something that feels really like, and I guess the pandemic to some extent actually felt like a surreal state of, oh, the world is fundamentally different than it was before. It felt like I was, the weird thing for me is I'm 26. And when the pandemic started, I was 24. And it felt like this official end to kind of my youth in a way. It was a very weird thing to kind of come into being like a real adult, like a 25-year-old, and to have it happen during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's weird because decline can happen for a long time. And I think that's one of the problems that many of your classical liberals and conservatives face is they don't realize that they came up in a time of decline. They think of their childhood as a time of plenty. You came up in the 80s or the 90s, economic booms, there a lot of, the 2000s even, things going pretty well materially. But if you look back, you realize that spiritually and like just ideologically, we were burning a lot of fuel to get where we were going in those decades. And it really was the kind of burning kind of the last bit of a lot of the American empire's goodwill, a lot of its built up social capital. And once we started hitting those points where the economic and social capital burns off, all of a sudden you start to look back and say, maybe things weren't as good as I thought they were at those times. Like they were good for me, but they were not putting us on a path, to prosperity or bettering ourselves. They were pretty much consigning us to where we are now. And so it's very weird to look back at those times, even though they were times of relative material success, and at the same time think that in those things were the seeds of kind of where we are today.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting point that I find myself thinking about quite often. Being my age, the basically my youth spans from, the very late 90s to like 2015-ish. And, during that time, I've reflected on it many times. And on one hand, I feel this gratitude of like, I didn't have to deal with so many of the things my ancestors had to deal with. I wasn't going to get like eaten by a bear or like killed in some kind of tribal conflict. I wasn't going to get tortured as part of an inquisition. There are all of these things where I'm like, I experienced so much less, physical pain than any of my ancestors were likely to experience in their lifetime. And it makes me think I'm really lucky. But then I think, I wonder about that sort of fulfillment aspect, because despite the fact that I relatively speaking, did not experience a ton of pain and suffering as a youth, there was a sort of, I know it's been said about a billion times by people up to and including Ben Shapiro, but the spiritual malaise, that there was always the sense of honesty that is, done to death in the pop culture of my time as well. And it makes me wonder, like, when you look back at people, our ancestors who came before us, they might have experienced less, objective physical pain and suffering because of medical advancements, technological advancements, but were they perhaps more fulfilled? And what does that trade-off mean? Because I'm very reticent to give up my modern medicine and my not having to be conscripted into a tribal conflict. I don't want to be, throwing spears at people. That's not in my nature. I don't know how good I would be at that, but I wonder if the fulfillment aspect of it would be worth it. It's a weird thing to think about.
Well, you have been conscripted into a tribal conflict, and that's something you never actually escape. Just because you're not slinging stones at someone doesn't mean you're not there. You're right that there's difficulty, right? Because in many ways, I think the most important thing is opposing progress as a core societal value. the notion of just because things are newer, because they are more complicated or something like that, they are therefore more valuable. I think is something you need to reject. At the same time, much of our understanding of the past is colored by the idea that we wouldn't have gotten antibiotics if we didn't also get like trans kids or something, and that's ridiculous, right? Like that's a major problem we have in our culture, is like it is assuming that we never would have made any kind of technological progress or medical progress if it hadn't been for also then accepting all of the social changes, all of the flattening of hierarchies, all of the political and changes in meaning, changes in religion, changes in family structure. You just can't get airplanes if you don't do that, and I think that's something that we need to reject. At the same time, we have to understand that there is a cost. Like you said, there is a cost for technological innovation. There is a cost for these kind of things, and we have to be mindful about what if we're willing to pay those things. Like, you can laugh at the Amish all day, but they're probably a lot happier than you, right? And me, right? And that's something that we really need to think about. If humanity had that level of control, like, and I don't think it does, sadly, but then it probably wouldn't have let social media happen, right? Like, social media is pretty clearly a net destroyer of joy in the world. It's not even close. Like, it's pretty clearly the case. And if humans had any level of self-control, they never would have done it. If you had an organization that was going around smashing, smartphones, they probably would have done a lot of good for the world in the long run. But we look at those people and say, "Oh, what idiots!" Right? Like, how foolish they would be to do that. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, we need to put human well-being first. We need to put that before the God of progress. But I don't know that at this point, especially with the mindset we have today, if that's even possible for most people. It's hard for me, and I'm someone who recognizes its necessity. It's very hard to pitch to people.
Yeah. What you said about the inevitability of the tribal conflict as it really struck pretty hard, because that has sort of been my sense over the course of the past few years, is that I thought my life was going to be pretty simple and easy. And then it occurred to me, I guess, at a time when it would naturally occur to many. I was like 21, 22 when I started to kind of have my quote unquote awakening. What it comes down to is something I wanted to discuss, which you recently retweeted somebody who said this on Twitter. I can't remember who the original person was. Maybe you'll know who this is generally attributed to. But the statement that you said that I think encapsulates this so well, that you retweeted, was you may not be interested in the culture war, but the culture war is very interested in you, which I loved. I mean, as soon as I saw that, I was like, this is awesome. This hits on something that I have been trying to explain to people for so long, and that you kind of told me a minute ago, which is like, oh, look where you are. You now you are conscripted into tribal conflict. And I've been trying to explain to people for the past few years that there's this weird meme on some parts of the right, and definitely on the progressive left, that like culture war issues are a distraction from the real issues, like taxes, like these things are like, which just strikes me as so inherently ridiculous. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do you get more people to understand that? Because to me, I guess what it comes down to is people think of it in terms of, how does this impact my life directly? And taxes, it's easy. It's like, taxes make me less money. Like, it's like this very like monkey brain thing where it's just like, I have less money because of taxes, which, by the way, is, does suck. I understand. But the culture war stuff, it's like, people want me to put my pronouns in my fucking email signature. I mean, there's things that are way more fundamental to like my experience as a human being than taxes. How do you get more people to understand that these issues obviously impact them and will continue to at an alarming rate in the near future?
Well, I think a lot of that work's being done for us because the material benefits are dwindling. When everyone was looking at how they could buy their second vacation home in Florida when they, go on retirement and, take, their 2 months of vacation every year, and everyone could look forward to this, this promised upper middle class existence as long as they went to college. You could sell that at the end of the day, the culture war stuff isn't really that important. You basically got the entire boomer generation to leverage their children's future on exactly this sales pitch. And so as it becomes clear to people of my generation and your generation that's not going to be available to us, they get a little more focused on these things. The fact that basically there is no place to run, you can no longer just kind of be quiet, keep your head down, build up your portfolio, and then retire somewhere where you can yell at Fox News. That's not an option anymore. This thing is everywhere. It's going to get to your kids. It's going to get to everything you love. It's going to destroy your hobbies. It's going to destroy everything you care about. The thing that people have a hard time with is they think that there's this magical neutral space, right? Where we reason things out, we rationalize things out. And eventually, you can shove all this, meaning of life stuff to the side, and we can just figure out like how to spreadsheet out the best economic outcome for people. Carl Schmitt talked about this. And if you want to do yourself an incredible favor on understanding our political situation, read Political Theology by Carl Schmitt. It's like 120 pages. It's super dense, but it's he writes in a very understandable way. So you might have to slow down, but it's something I think most people can get if they stick with it. And what Schmitt says is basically liberalism is a trick. It's a trick to obfuscate the friend-enemy distinction. We have differing ideas, different cultures, and we have different ideas of the good. And our different ideas of the good are not like mildly different. They're like existentially threatening to each other's groups. But what liberalism did is it kind of like allowed us to all shove that stuff in a broom closet and then just be like, okay, what's the minimum way in which we can interact with each other? How can we reduce morality to like its basic nuts and bolts so that like we can sell each other widgets without killing each other? And that was a good trick for a while, right? Like it got rid of a lot of wars, and it saved us a lot of money, and it made a lot of money, and people were tired of the whole thing. And so like in some ways it sounds good. But the problem is, like, at the end of the day, the friend enemy distinction is still operating. Like, there are still people who are friends of the ruling class, and there's still enemies who are people who are enemies of the ruling class. And even if the people operating your society have told you that they're operating things in some kind of neutral system, they aren't. There is no such thing as being ruled by a neutral system. Everyone is being ruled by someone, and those people have opinions, and they have thoughts on what you should think and how you should act. And if the things that you think and the way you act threatens the system, you're the enemy, and they're going to look to remove you or marginalize you. And that's the problem. Is we thought we had escaped tribal conflict. We thought that we had moved beyond this we become a new age of very advanced people who no longer needed these distinctions, and we could all interact on this basic level. But the reason everything feels like it's falling apart is really it's just a shattering of an illusion that's a couple hundred years old. And we're just returning back to what is the natural state of humanity, which is people who have fundamentally different understandings of what the common good is, having a really hard time of like hashing this out. Now, if you had a more honest conversation about political realities and limitations, you might be able to enter situations where you could coexist with some sections of society disagreeing. But the way we have things set up now, we've made that basically completely unavailable because we've obfuscated so much of the political reality that anyone who even nods at the possibility that, things aren't copacetic with kind of the liberal order is an incredible and imminent threat to our democracy. And, that's the term getting thrown around now. If you say, hey, maybe we should close the borders, or, maybe we have to care about like what people actually make and whether they have like the ability to have kids. You're a threat to democracy. That's the term that gets thrown out because we're seeing this over and over again.
Yeah. I think the cold, hard reality of it all and the inevitability of it all sort of has manifested itself in one particularly strange way that I've noticed over the course of the past few years, which is I know these types of people have existed for a long time, but I didn't really start to notice them until recently. The emergence of the Bugman or the soy boy or whatever you want to call them. When you reference the fact that this stuff is basically impossible to ignore at this point, especially the course of the past few years, the way it becomes apparent to everyone because it infects pretty much everything. And when I bring up the idea of the Bugman or the soy boy, the reason I do that is because I think it takes a very specific type of man in particular to continue to ignore these things, basically. Because there is a type of person who will do that, who will say like, no, everything's still great. I want to consume. I want to be subjected to 24/7 advertising and purchasing of this bullshit that is clearly awful. And that anyone who puts even the slightest bit of thought into it or has the slightest bit of like that sort of male gumption, that male energy would notice. It has occur, because the reason I bring this up is because that type of person has really started to baffle me in recent years. For instance, I don't know what this face is. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I've never made that face in my life up until 3 seconds ago. I don't know what that is. And I think that it has something to do with the fact that in order to continue to accept this kind of thing, you have to be completely emasculated, and that's not even a good enough way to describe it. It's there's a lack of soul to somebody who would continue to ignore what is happening even now at this point.
Yeah, but I think, it's a large percentage of the population. And I think for many of us, I think myself included, we were probably in that population at some point. I know it took a pretty tragic turn of events in my life for me to understand that while I don't think I was ever fully Bugman in that sense, many of those things had a hold of me. There were many things that were making me feel like it was okay not to take control of my life and not to make something meaningful. I think there were many distractions in my life that I was allowing myself to sink into that would allow me to, not take action in the way that I should. And so even for people who aren't completely in it, it's still very alluring. I think all of us have some of it, are touched by it in some way, but there is certainly a person who is, like you said, just completely checked out. That's what's so interesting, of course, about what Gamergate was, right? Is the Gamergate was the shattering of the Bugman mentality for a percentage of the population. It was people who were plugged in to video games and comic books and things that I loved as a kid and I was plugged into. But places that you thought like, okay, well, maybe the world has moved on and there's not a place for me as a man here, but I can, sink my time into these things, and at least, leveling up in this video game hits the dopamine receptor and I feel like I did something right. And that's not to say like you can't play video games. Like I still play some video games, but the point is like there's a difference between that and sitting on World of Warcraft 10 hours a day, and that really was an option for a lot of people until wokeness came into those spaces, right? And that's what Gamergate for a lot of people was, is they realized like, okay, there's something that is not going to just let me sit here. I can't even hide in my escape anymore. I can't even escape to my fantasy anymore. Every part of the world now has to be this. And so that the good thing is that shattered the Bugman illusion for a decent percentage of the population. It is hard. I agree with you. It's hard to look at how woke a lot of this stuff is and still wonder how people enjoy it. I know many of my hobbies from the past, I simply cannot go back to because it's impossible to even subject myself to it and not feel dirty in some way to expose myself to some of those things that exist there now. And that my hobby pool is shrinking because of that. But in the end, that's a good thing, because that's probably why I ended up, doing YouTube. That's probably why I ended up reading a lot more than I used to, going to the gym more. Like those things are now more of a priority because the things that would have kept me from doing them aren't in my way anymore.
That message, Auron, hits close to home, and it's a fairly optimistic message. And so I think knowing that I know that you do have limited time this afternoon, I think that's where we can go ahead and sign off for the day. But before we sign off, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to let people know where they can find you on social media, anything you want to plug or promote whatsoever. Is there anything you want to promote before we sign off for the day?
Sure. So they can find my YouTube channel and Twitter. Everything's Auron MacIntyre. You can Google it and it'll be there. I have a Rumble and Odyssey channel, which I encourage people to log on to. They just had another Twitter purge here, and you just never know how long you're going to be on these more mainstream platforms. So make sure you follow every creator you like on alt tech, so that if they go down on the more mainstream stuff, you can still find them. But yeah, those would be the main things. Just the Twitter and the YouTube at this point. I always get around to I always mean to get around to producing more, but with family and everything else, that's kind of the limit of my ability to produce right now.
Gotcha. Well, thanks very much for being on the show, Auron, and everyone be sure to, check out what he's doing on Twitter, on YouTube. Thanks for being here. Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks everyone for listening. If you are on iTunes listening there, please leave a 5-star review. It really, really helps get the show out to more people. If you're watching on YouTube, please you cannot dislike anymore. So if you're going to engage in that at all, you have, although I guess you can dislike, but it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah,
Only
they can't
I can
see it.
Yeah. So anyway, like the video or dislike it, I guess, if you really want to. Please like it, please comment, please subscribe. I appreciate you all, and I'll see you next time on the Veritas podcast.